These colonists think that they can use my services, use my army to protect them from the French and the Indians, and not have to pay for it? Should I, King George III, have to fund everything? Is it not fair? Is it not justice that they assist me to pay for what they use to protect themselves? As a just king, it is my right, my option, my duty to make sure that everything is in order, that our wars are funded, that our people are protected, and I will do that whether the colonists like it or not, whether the colonists want to pay their fair share or not. Isn't it only fair that they pay their fair share? We are going to implement the Quartering Acts. The colonists are going to house our soldiers. We are going to implement the Sugar Act, and they are going to pay taxes on sugar and molasses. We are going to implement the Stamp Act. And they will buy their paper from England, and they will have a special stamp on every piece of paper that they use that they will have to pay for, and we will use those funds to pay for the war that they wanted us to fight, the French and Indian War. Or should we have allowed the French and the Indians just to control them, to dominate them? No, no, no. These colonists are out of control. We will put our soldiers on their streets if we have to. We will put our boats in their harbors if we have to. People like Samuel Adams and John Hancock smuggling illegal goods into the colonies in defiance of my rightful claim as the King of England and the ruler of the American colonies. The Quartering Act is put into place in 1765 by King George and Parliament, and what that meant is there were English soldiers who were living in the American colonies. They were living in Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. They were living in New York and Philadelphia and all over the colonies. And these soldiers, right, housing them would have cost money. It would have said, the king, he owed a lot of money to the banks, right? The king was in all this debt. He owed the bank all this money for the French and Indian War. And he said, you know what? The colonists have to pay for this. And one of the ways in which they can help pay for it is they can provide beds for our soldiers to sleep in. They can provide them food. And the only reason the king felt he had to have the soldiers there, yes, protection, French-Indian War, but he felt that he had to have the soldiers there because the colonists weren't following his decrees or the laws put in place by himself in Parliament. He felt that the colonists were trying to get around the Stamp Act, get around the Sugar Act, and that they were in defiance. And in response to that, he was going to have them house his soldiers so that he didn't have to pay for a roof over their head, for a bed for them to sleep on, and even food, because according to the Quartering Act, it was the responsibility of the colonists to not only house the soldiers, but to feed them. So, because the colonists were protesting and boycotting that he put certain taxes into place, like taxes on tea and whatnot, and the colonists were using their boats to bring in tea from other countries illegally. So he said, okay, well, I'll put my naval ships into Boston Harbor and the colonies, specifically Boston and Massachusetts, right? Boston's in Massachusetts, because he said these guys are defiant. They are not listening. They are not well behaved. So he put his warships, imagine that, pulling up on your shores to hold the colonists in check, to make sure that they listen, to make sure that they stay in line. And look at those cannons. Do you want that pointing at you? Well, these ships were packing some big guns, just like I'm packing a big old Nerf gun. I wanted to do that. So these colonists were packing, the English Navy had their ships in Boston Harbor. They're packing these gigantic cannons, right? And they were there to try to stop people like John Hancock, someone who you'll hear more about later on, but he was a Bostonian in Boston, Massachusetts, and he didn't like that the English crown and king and parliament were telling the colonists what they could and could not buy, and he said, you know what, if they're going to try to restrict our access to tea, I'm just going to take my boat, take my ship, and I'll bring in the tea myself. Well, in comes these naval ships with their big cannons, their big guns, and they said, no, we're going to stop that, Johnny boy. Right? John Hancock. They put their soldiers on the street in uniform with guns. And these soldiers would knock on your door and say, you had better give me a bed to sleep in. And if you tried to say no, the law was on the side of the soldiers. They could pull that gun out on you, right? Give me your food. You have to pay for the war, the French and Indian War, colonists. And these soldiers were everywhere. They were in the streets. And relations between the soldiers and the colonists had really gotten to a bad point. And the colonists, the Sons of Liberty, right? That's Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Paul Revere and John Adams and all these guys, right? In Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, they did not like what was going on, and they were rebelling. And everywhere they went, you would see these soldiers, and there was resentment. The soldiers, they had a hostile view of the colonists because they were like, hey, what is the problem with these guys? We came here, we fought the French and Indian War, and now they're trying to get out of paying for it, and they're giving us a hard time because they're the ones not listening. They're the ones in defiance. And the soldiers would call the Bostonian, they said, look at these Yankees, and they would say that as an insult. You're a Yankee, as an insult. Well, tensions were very high, and they did not like one another. In fact, there were a few incidents, but in 1770, things would really come to a head because this man was, he was stumbling around, and he had too much to drink. He was drunk, and this guy is walking around, and he walks into a bar, and he bumps into a soldier. He bumps into a British soldier. And he's like, watch where you're going, you damn Yankee! Yeah, you watch where you're going, you redcoat. You watch your mouth there, a little fresh. Should get out of here. What are you going to do about it? I'll show you what I'm going to do about it. I'm going to take my musket and boom! Oh! Boom! And the English soldier hit that colonist with the musket. And when he hit him, the colonist yelled out, ah! And people heard. And people started to gather around. And before you know it, there was a big crowd around this English soldier. And the crowd was not happy. Well, other soldiers, other English soldiers, right? They came to help. They said, we're coming to help. We're coming to help. In total, there were 8 English soldiers surrounded by this mob of angry Bostonians, of angry colonists. And the colonists were so angry that they started picking up snowballs and ice balls. It was cold outside. Snowballs and ice balls and throwing it at the soldiers and throwing sticks at the soldiers. And one colonist actually stood up right in front of the British soldier and said, shoot me, I dare you. Right? Well, a stick would come in and hit one of the soldiers, and he got scared, and he did. He shot. And they opened fire, and 3 colonists were shot dead in the street. And 5 more were wounded. And there were riots and outrage, and the ramifications of that would echo all the way through until the point where they had the American Revolution a few years later. So imagine this scene where the English soldiers are in town, they're surrounded by this giant mob of angry colonists who are throwing snowballs at them, who are throwing sticks at them, who are throwing ice at them, hitting them with sticks, and then one of the soldiers gets scared, he opens fire, boom, before you know it, 3 people are dead, blood in the streets, 5 other people are wounded. This was the Boston Massacre. Now, did the colonists shoot back? They didn't shoot back because they didn't have guns to shoot back with. But here's a picture of not a picture, here is a painting, a depiction of the English soldiers opening fire on the colonists. And what do you see when you look at it, right? Their hands are up. They're, oh, don't shoot me, don't, right? And they're being shot, right? They look defenseless, right? Well, after the Boston Massacre, in which the colonists who didn't have guns themselves were shot down by English soldiers who are the government, right? The English government. The soldiers are the army of the king, right? They do what the king says. If the king says you go fight a French and Indian war, they go fight a French and Indian war. If the king says you go guard Massachusetts, then you go guard Massachusetts. Well, the Boston Massacre would have tremendous impact on the next few years because the Boston Gazette, a newspaper, they would take advantage of the situation and they started putting out their own propaganda. And Paul Revere, someone who we're going to talk about in a little bit, he would put out an article and he would call it "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated on King Street." And they made paintings and pictures, and they told all of the colonists that these terrible, mean, tyrannical English soldiers opened fire on defenseless colonists. Now, we've learned about propaganda for those of you that have taken my course, and for those of you that haven't, well, you should definitely do that, and we'll learn more about that. But is Paul Revere's depiction of what happened accurate? Were the colonists innocent, defenseless people who were shot for no reason? Well, that's for you to decide, right? I mean, they would say that, hey, listen, the English army shouldn't have been there in the first place, and they were an occupying force, and yeah, of course we were angry. But from the English side, right, they would say, the soldier is just doing his job, he's standing around, and next thing you know, there's a mob of people, they're throwing ice and snow and sticks, and the soldiers were in danger, and they were defending themselves. In fact, John Adams, one of the Sons of Liberty, would actually, surprisingly, defend the soldiers in court when they went to trial. But it's an interesting example of propaganda and how the colonists said, look what happened, look at these dirty English, and the English said, what are you talking about? These are innocent people. Now, you can decide which is true and which is false, but every story has two sides, and if you want to truly understand history, you always have to study both sides because, well, there's two sides to every story, and then usually a third side that's the right side. But it all started, right? It started way back when, right? Years before this. So the Boston Massacre was in 1770, right? Well, this all started 7 years earlier, at the end of the French and Indian War, when the English and the colonists were on the same team, along with the Mohawk Indians, were on the same team. They were fighting together against the French and other Indian tribes. And they had this war, and they were great friends and teammates, and they beat back the French and the Indians. And then after the war, things went sideways. This was 1763. Then King George says, hey, you know what? This war was very expensive, and you, the colonists, have to pay for it. Because King George owed money to who? Da-da-da-da-da, the bank. Because every single war that is fought in human history, whether it's the American Revolution, right, or whether it's wars that are fought today, require money, they require funding. Banks are an integral part of any war. Never forget that. Always track the money if you want to know what's going on. And King George, he owed $133 million, which was a lot of money back then, to these banks, and he said the colonists were going to pay for it. So he passed the Sugar Act of 1764, taxes on sugar and molasses. He passed the Stamp Act of 1765. Any type of paper you're using for any business or personal use, you better get that paper from England, from Britain, and have our special stamp right on it. Look at that skull and bones. Yes, we will learn more about that skull and bones in the future, because that certainly is important symbolism. But that's for another day. But the important thing is that he said you're going to pay tax on paper. You're going to pay tax. And the colonists, they weren't happy about that. And then the Quartering Act, which we discussed, right? Where the king and parliament say, hey, listen, our soldiers keeping them in your colonies, keeping them in Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, that cost money. So you house them. You just let them in your house and feed them too. And the colonists protested, "No Sugar Act," and they had a lobbying cry, which we'll get more into, but they would say, "No taxation without representation. You can't just make us pay these taxes when we don't get any say in it. That's not fair." That's what the colonists would say. And the colonists, they were very successful, right, in their protest, in getting the taxes pushed back, because they were capable. They didn't need things from Britain, right, from England. They said, "Listen, we don't need your food, we don't need your goods, your services, your tea. We're farmers. We grow our own food. We take care of our animals. We are blacksmiths who we make our own material. We make our own goods out of metal. We are carpenters, and we build our own homes," right? So these were very capable people. They made their own clothing. They made their own shoes, and they boycotted and protested, and they were very successful. And to the point in which the King of England and Parliament, they actually got rid of the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, because they were like, "Hey, these boycotts are so successful, we're actually losing money," right? Very important. The way you live is what makes you free. Not the government. The way you live is what makes you free. And I wonder if people today would be able to pull off boycotts like that or protests like that. Because people today, they don't grow their own food. They don't, so many people don't start their own businesses, which all of you should do, because all of you are capable of doing that. Because if you really want to be free, you have to position yourself in a way in which a king or a government can't tell you what to do. The Townshend Acts of 1767, which is what put the tea tax situation into place, in the first place, right? It had to do with a few things. The Townshend Acts limited the colonists' ability to import paint, paper, lead, tea, glass. It put political restrictions on the colonies, and it set up special courts so the colonists didn't feel like if something happened between, I don't know, the English soldiers and the colonists said, "Hey, you know what? They should be in our courts. We should decide if they're guilty." And the King of England said, "No, my soldiers will be judged by the English." So that would lead directly to the Boston Massacre. Drunk man in a bar, he's in the bar, he talks a little bit of trash, he gets pistol whipped by a soldier. Next thing you know, colonists surround the soldier. There's a bunch of angry colonists. Get out of here, you traitors! Right? And then, the soldiers say, "You get out of here! You get out of here, you bloody Yankees!" Right? And the next thing you know, shots are fired, 3 people are dead, 5 are wounded. Fast forward 3 years later, the colonists, all that anger, all that resentment built up, the Boston Tea Party, right? The Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, and these boys, right? They dress up as Indians, Native Americans, they climb on a ship, and they throw millions of dollars worth of tea into Boston Harbor. Which then the King of England responds to that. He says, "You're going to do your Boston Massacre, and you're going to then do your Boston Tea Party and throw our tea out. Well, we'll do the intolerable acts. You are no longer allowed to meet up with each other. You are no longer allowed to gather and assemble. You no longer get to make your own laws. You have had your rights taken. You do what we say you do." And then the king had a plan. "These colonists think they could defy me. Well, I'll send my soldiers out in the middle of the night, and we will sneakily show up and take away all of their guns. And then once we have their guns, we will tell them what to do, and they will have no way of fighting back." So in the middle of the night, King George III sends out the redcoats, and they march. And you got to remember, this was before electricity, right? This was candlelight, right? It was pitch black. Everyone's sleeping. You don't have lights at night. People go to sleep. Everyone's sleeping, middle of the night. Here come the redcoats. The British are coming. But Paul Revere, remember? Paul Revere wrote that propaganda piece after the Boston Massacre, right? He called it, what did Paul Revere call it? "Bloody Massacre perpetuated on King Street. Well, Paul Revere, he sees the redcoats marching, and he gets on his horse and rides. The British are coming! The British are coming! And the Sons of Liberty wake up, and they get their guns, and they wait for the British. And when the British arrive, they say, surrender your guns, give up your arms, or we're going to physically take them. And the colonists say, back down. And then the shot heard round the world. The British were coming to take the firearms, the guns of the colonists, so that the colonists could not defend themselves. So if the colonists, right, if they didn't open fire in that moment, would they have been able to defend themselves once the British took their guns? Or would they have had to do whatever the king said? Let me ask you a question. Is the act of confiscating the guns themselves, is the British showing up and saying, give me your guns, the same as basically opening fire, right? Because, right, if the colonists stand their ground and say, no, you can't have our guns, what's the only way the British could take them away, right? They would have to shoot the colonists then. Well, the colonists opened fire first. The shot heard around the world. Shot heard around the world. That would lead to the American Revolution. That was the start of the American Revolution that night. It started over guns. That the king was trying to take away the guns from the colonists. Remember the Boston Massacre? The Boston Massacre, the colonists were shot and they didn't have any guns. The Quartering Act, men with guns from the government showing up at your house telling you, I'm going to sleep in your bed and you're going to feed me and there's nothing you can do about it. Then Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world where King George tried to steal what guns the colonists did have in the middle of the night. And the colonists decided enough was enough. If we don't have our guns, then what chance do we have at freedom? So they would win the American Revolutionary War, and years later they would put together the Bill of Rights. And in the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights, this is the high law of our land, the Second Amendment, they write, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Notice that again, the document does not say you have been given the right to bear arms. It assumes, it implies you already have that right. All it says is the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, right? It might as well say the right to bear arms, which you already have, that right doesn't come from this document, shall not be infringed. It is a restriction on the government of the United States of America, and it states that they shall not infringe our right to bear arms. So this week I want you to think about, based on the Boston Massacre, based on the Quartering Act, and based on the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, why did the Founding Fathers think it's so important that to make the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution the right to bear arms? And do you think that right is important today? Do you think if your mom and your dad and your family and your countrymen weren't allowed to have guns, if we would have the same power to tell the government, hey, listen, I don't like what you're doing here? Or do you think that the Founding Fathers positioned us because they knew, listen, the government, whether we like it or not, will always try to do things that maybe might not be fair, and although the First Amendment, free speech, is ultimately how we want things handled, and friendly discourse, ultimately, if that doesn't work, then the people have to have a right to defend themselves. All right, guys, you think about that, and I look forward to seeing you next week.